The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. After he had fed the people, Jesus made the disciples get into a boat and precede him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. After doing so, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When it was evening, he was there alone. Meanwhile, the boat, already a few miles offshore, was being tossed about by the waves, for the wind was against it. During the fourth watch of the night, he came toward them walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. "It is a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. At once Jesus spoke to them, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Peter said to him in reply, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." Peter got out of the boat and began to walk on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw how strong the wind was, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught Peter, and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" After they got into the boat, the wind died down. Those who were in the boat did him homage, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." The Gospel of the Lord. Some common fears include the fear of heights, fear of flying, and the fear of public speaking. We could add today the fear of getting COVID, the fear of returning to school or to work, and of course, the fear of death. All of these fears have one thing in common. They push us beyond our comfort zones. Human beings like being in control. We enjoy doing what's familiar, yet we know we're capable of more. Sometimes we just need an extra push. Consider the disciples in today's gospel. They've been pushed far beyond their comfort zones. Although they're professional fishermen, they're caught in a storm so strong, they're afraid they may drown. Imagine the giant waves crashing in over their boat, their clothes soaking wet, wind and water blowing in their faces, causing them to slip, to wince, to cough. Where is Jesus? He's in the relative safety of the mountains nearby, praying by himself. In fact, this is the first time the disciples are ever without Jesus. And look what happens. Disaster strikes. Death comes knocking on their doors. Why does Jesus wait until the night was nearly over before he comes to his disciples' aid? It isn't like he was oblivious to the storm. He must have felt the wind and the rain too. But unlike his disciples, Jesus was resting safely on solid ground. Perhaps the Lord wanted to push his disciples beyond their comfort zones, to test their faith, to see how they would react to his perceived absence. That's a test some of us have felt before too, like we're alone in the boat. The waters of trial or temptation rage, and Jesus is nowhere to be found. Even when Jesus does appear, Peter thinks he's a ghost. Crying out to him, Peter says, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." Sounds like an absurd request. As a fisherman, Peter knows all about water, but he spent his whole life walking on land. Perhaps he never dreamt of doing anything more. The land is solid, sturdy, a place of comfort and familiarity. The land is Peter's comfort zone. But now he's asking Jesus to do what seems impossible. Peter steps out onto the water and sinks. But not because he couldn't continue, but because he was afraid. He was pushed beyond his comfort zone. How many of us feel like we're trying to walk on water, as if the ground isn't solid beneath us? Is it possible to stand, to continue? Or like Peter, will we question our faith and sink? Consider an addict stepping out of the boat, walking towards sobriety for the very first time. The thousands of teachers who stepped out of their classrooms, moving their careers online. First-time parents stepping out of the hospital, driving their newborn child home. Or the tens of millions of people affected by COVID, cancer, unemployment, or an uncertain future. Maybe you're like me, just an imperfect believer, trying to step out of the boat, out of my comfortable life, into deeper faith. Can we do it? Of course we can. The Lord stands before us saying, as he did to Peter, "Come." His words are not meant to taunt us. Jesus is sincere in his desire to sustain us while stretching our faith. But we must trust that his power is greater than the waves we face. As St. Paul says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Meaning, I can become sober. I can raise this child. I can teach my students successfully. I can beat this disease. I can grow in faith. I can step out onto the water, whatever that means for me, because Christ is already there. As the old saying goes, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step.